Generally, when an abuser or an addict faces hard, clear, consistent boundaries, they will adjust their behavior, but not the responsibility taking.
Hello, this is Gretchen Baskerville, and I'm the author of The Life-Saving Divorce, Hope for People Leaving Destructive Relationships. And today it's my honor to interview Bob Hamp, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist. He's been in practice 30 years. He's a Christian and the co-founder of the Think Differently Academy. And by the way, his academy has just launched its own social media site. You can set up your own profile. It's a little bit more private than what you get on on Facebook and Twitter, and you can really get involved with sharing. So go to tdacad.com. So today we're going to talk about how do I know if my abuser has changed? Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, Gretchen. And again, I'm super excited. I have such great respect for your work and the way we kind of found each other on Twitter, which is fascinating to me. And I saw your research and how, first of all, I love the fact that it's all research-based, not just opinion, not just, anecdotal, but you've got solid research that literally saves lives. And so I was immediately drawn to your work. So I'm very honored to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. Well, you've got great insights for that person who says, my spouse, my abusive spouse, really claims to want to reconcile and really claims to be changing and actually gets mad at me when I don't see that change necessarily. How do you help people in this situation, Bob?
Well, first and foremost, if they get mad at you because you don't see their change, that's the first clue that they have not changed even an iota. And we'll make sense about that as we go, but that is such a common story that you just told. Let me put in front of you this grand change that I've engineered. And if you don't feel the way I do about it, then you're broken and something's wrong with you, you bad, terrible person, you. So let's, if you haven't watched the episode that Gretchen and I did on the dynamics of abuse, it's important, if you're going to recognize change when it happens, it's important to recognize that the foundation of all abuse is this thing that we call the misassignment of responsibility. The abuser makes their victim responsible to carry their emotional weight, to carry their emotional burden. And in many cases, the abused victim readily accepts that emotional responsibility because they're kind, compassionate, and generous. There's a fine line sometimes between kind, compassionate, and generous, and the willingness to carry something that's not yours in an unhealthy or harmful way. And the trick to that is that a relationship that's healthy is mutual. Both people will carry each other's burden when the time arises. But in an abusive relationship, it's always one way. The abuser has emotional deficit, the abused victim has emotional resource, and the abuser demands that they exchange their pluses for their minuses, or their resource for their deficit. Gretchen, when you asked before in the other episode, it's an example of that would be, if you would just be nicer to me, I wouldn't drink. Mm-hmm. In other words, the addict is putting their deficit, making it the responsibility of their partner, and they're telling them that if they would be a better partner, there's their resource. If you give me more of your resource, then I wouldn't drink. And that plus minus exchange is at the root of all abuse.
Instead of taking the responsibility themselves for their drinking, they want to shift it to someone else. All right. So let's say, go ahead.
One of the magic tricks that abusers use to try to fool people into believing they're changed is they'll change behaviorally, right?
Like maybe they'll throw out all the bottles, or they'll won't go out drinking with their buddies. So now what?
Maybe they'll literally even stop drinking. Well, let's use the way you introduced this. I've stopped drinking. Can't you see that I've changed? Now I'm angry at you that you can't see my change. Who's taking responsibility and who's giving responsibility in that exchange? The addict may have literally stopped drinking for a season, but what's happening is if they're angry at you for not acknowledging their change, now they're taking their deficit. Hey, I struggled with addiction, and making it your problem. If you can't see that I've changed, you're the bad one here. Mm-hmm. If you would see that I've changed, then I would be okay. It's the exact same thing now. Instead of with alcohol, now it's with blame. But that exchange of responsibility If that doesn't change, then nothing has changed.
Okay, so first of all, just their defensiveness is a clue that they haven't changed at all.
Right. Defensiveness is a shield to taking responsibility.
Got it.
You're trying to hand me legitimate responsibility, and if I hand it back to you, then I'm still practicing my abusive dynamic.
Okay.
And the tricky part is they may have stopped if the abuse is violence, if the abuse is sexual, if the abuse is an addiction, if, whatever it might be, they may have stopped the behavior, but if they continue to not accept responsibility, zero change has happened. Here's what I think you need to know. There are 3 things that I think are the key signs that an abuser has changed. And why this matters so much is because abuse typically takes place in a cycle that includes times where the abusive symptom is front and center, and times at the bottom of the cycle, just like a circle, times at the bottom of the cycle where everything seems better. And because of that season of things being better, the victim wants to buy that season of better as if it's permanent change. Nobody wants it to be permanent change more than I do. I genuinely wish that it were. But I also know that season of change, or that season of what appears to be change, if it's just the next step to running around the cycle one more time, then taking the wrong steps in that moment can actually feed the fires of abuse instead of finally put them out for good. So
you've got this, you're down at the bottom of the cycle and you're hopeful. So what are the wrong things to do and what are the right things to do?
The wrong things to do is in that moment to give up on the boundaries that got you there in the first place. Right?
Okay, what does that look like?
Generally, when an abuser or an addict faces hard, clear, consistent boundaries, they will adjust their behavior, but not the responsibility taking. You've set some boundaries, and maybe you've said, and I often tell people this. So what you want to do if you're dealing with somebody who's not taking responsibility, you want to draw for them a circle and say, in this circle is relationship the way I'm willing to do it. You want to join me in this? And you define that circle as mutuality, support, open communication, responsibility taking, empathic connection. And if that's what relationship is, if you want to join me in this circle, I would love for you to join me in the circle. However, if you're not willing to be participating in those things, you automatically are outside the circle. So the abuser says, oh, of course I want to join you in the circle. I want to be in relationship with you. I lose my supply if I'm outside the circle.
Okay. They want you. They want what you have to bring.
They want
your kindness, your goodness, your generosity. They want those things from you. But and so they'll act like they want to get into the circle. But the big question becomes, will they actually do what they need to?
Right. They make behavioral changes to get back inside the circle. And what they want is for you to back off on the boundaries that you set in the first place. Inside here is how relationship works. Now that you're in here, I expect mutuality, I expect empathy, I expect connection, I expect support, and I expect to give those things to you as well. Once they're allowed back in, let's say that you've asked them to leave or you've left because of their drinking. The first thing they're going to want is, how soon can I move back in?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not how much change do you need to see, but how soon can I get back in?
Right.
They want to define it in terms of time. I would want people to define it in terms of maintained boundaries. If you can take responsibility, and let me give you the 3 key things. Number 1, take responsibility. Number 2, genuinely express empathy.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go deeper with all 3 of these in just a minute. And number 3, do number 1 and number 2 over time. And I might even say publicly.
Wow. Okay.
Well,
give us some more detail on those.
Number 1 is responsibility. Because if abuse is the misassignment of responsibility, for the abuser to genuinely change, they must take full responsibility. Not just, I'm sorry. I'm sorry isn't responsibility taking. It's a drill to try to get through your boundaries. Responsibility taking names what they did. It names the impact of what they did. And it names who and how many other people were affected by what they did. I didn't stop drinking, and because of that, you were left unprotected, and the kids were put in danger. That's responsibility taking. Add to that empathy, because what they have to be able to do, and I'm going to tell you why these two things they're almost two sides of the coin. Add to that empathy. Empathy says, here's what it was like to be you in relationship to me. You have suffered. I have blamed you, and other people have thought you were the bad guy when I'm really the bad guy. Empathy actually leads to changed behavior. Empathy says, because you've experienced this painful thing at my hands, I'm actually going to go undo that. When the 12 steps of AA talks about making amends, part of that is going to undo the wrong that you've done.
I really love how you said that, empathy, because so many people get kind of blindsided by like an onslaught of flowers or gifts or sentimental jewelry or things like that. But what you're really looking for is real responsibility, knowing what they did to you, what it cost you, and then empathizing with you. And family members can sometimes say, well, he gave you this beautiful bracelet. He really loves you. Why don't you get back together?
Can't you see he's changed?
And I love how you said, there are these things that I have to have in this relationship. That's what you can keep your jewelry, you can keep your flowers, you can keep your chocolates or your fancy dinners. This is what I want.
The husband or the abuser who declares that they will die for their spouse is not really giving much. I want to know, will they live for them? Will they live as if they have caused pain, or will they live as if they want you to sweep it under the rug? Responsibility says, I did this and here's what it cost. Empathy says, here's what you've experienced because of my choices. And number three is that number one and number two needs to be public, and it needs to be over time. It needs to be public in the sense that if there were other people who saw and believed that the abuser was the good guy and the victim was the bad guy, the abuser has to stand up and correct that mistake. When you see this in churches where the leader has been abusive and people stand up against it and they're blamed for trying to harm this leader, and then when the truth comes out, for the church to make that right, they have to publicly say, we wronged these people. They were right. This leader was wrong.
It's so important.
So crucial. You can't move past it if you don't, because part of what was made wrong wasn't just the abuse that happened, but that the system supported it. And the system continued to put negative responsibility on the victim and to make the abuser appear to be the victim. And
so many people in my group either were disciplined by their church, even to the point in the extreme cases of being excommunicated for simply saying, I don't want to be in this abusive relationship any longer.
It's the forgiveness dilemma, because we're told as believers that forgiveness is the solution to this problem. And quite honestly, it's the wrong medicine for the disease.
Okay.
What I always tell people is that forgiveness deals with the past, but in the case of an ongoing harmful behavior, boundaries and consequences are the solution, not forgiveness.
That's powerful. And the church gets on your case for not forgiving, because forgiving is equated in their minds as reconciling, trusting, welcoming them back with open arms.
We said this in the other episode, and I think this is so important. For the abuser to change, they have to take responsibility, express empathy, do so publicly over time. For the victim to change, they have to stop taking responsibility, hand the responsibility back to the abuser, and then step back and not carry their emotional burden. And people see that and they believe it's bitterness, anger, even gossip, when in fact they're actually doing the healthiest necessary thing to right the wrong of misassigned responsibility.
Give us an example. Let's say that the church, the women's director comes to a woman and says, I'm a little bit worried, you don't seem to be, forgiving Jim. What does the woman say?
Well, first, I want to give great empathy to that woman or that man, whoever it might be, because that's such a common thing. And far too often they believe they buy that. They swallow that as if that was the medicine and they're just not mature enough to give it. But if I were just going to be clinical about it and tell you the right answer, the women's director has come to this woman and said, you just don't seem to be forgiving. And I think I would want the woman to turn back to her and say, let me ask you this question. if he were going to do it again tonight and again tomorrow and again the next day, should I just sit back and practice my forgiveness, or should I protect myself from the expected future harm? Which one do you want me to do?
Good question.
So it's easy to come up with when I'm talking to a friendly face like Gretchen Baskerville. It's just not easy to do when you're in the heat of the expectations of what a culture that should have supported you and isn't generally very equipped to do that.
Yeah.
But I think we have to, again, put responsibility on those people who are asking those questions and say, how much harm are you asking me to endure?
Right.
If this was in the past, I would be happy to, talk about forgiveness. Now, I may not talk about reconciliation, but I'd be happy to talk about forgiveness. But because it's in the present and because it's ongoing, now the woman's director, let's play this out, Gretchen. Let's say the woman's director says, what do you mean? I heard that he stopped hitting you.
Right.
Well, you're right. He has stopped hitting me. But what hasn't changed is he still hasn't taken responsibility for any of the harm done, and he hasn't taken responsibility for any of the choices he made that did harm. And because of that, I don't really sense any way to know that there's safety for the kids and I in the future, because he hasn't really addressed the real issue. He's only changed the behavior.
I don't sense that he's any less entitled to feeling like, he gets everything his way.
Yeah. So you probably get this from me already. I am extremely passionate about helping people redefine abuse as the misassignment of responsibility, because I think the solutions are buried in there.
Yeah.
If we only look at the behavior, we get fooled all the time.
Look right in the camera and speak to the abused wives, and in some cases, the abused husbands in my Life Saving Divorce private group on Facebook. What do you tell them to do?
I would tell you to remember who you were before the abuse started. I think sometimes we want to correct the problem with our own behavioral change, when I would submit to you that there was a point in your life that you were somebody who had emotional strength, who had the capacity to bear up under very difficult situations, and who had the capacity to stand for yourself in the face of difficult situations. And abuse will wear you down. And when the culture around you supports that abusive dynamic, that'll wear you down. And before you even take a step, before you begin to utter the first word of boundary setting, take some time to remember. I feel like, the Lion King for a minute here, but remember who you were. Remember who you were when you had the strength that hadn't been worn down by the pervasive blame shifting and screaming and manipulation and drug use and all the ways that the abuse has worn you down. Remember that person, because he or she is still in there. And he or she is worth getting to a place of safety. And he or she is worth getting to a place where the strength that was once yours can be yours again. Because if you've got the resource to give to somebody who can't utilize it to get healthy, then you've got the resource to give to a whole bunch of people who are trying to get healthy. So find the real you again, fight for her or fight for him, and do what you can to get that person back. That's the person that God created, and that's the person that Jesus died for. And that's the person he wants to resurrect.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you, Bob. This has been really excellent. And I appreciate so much your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen. It's been a pleasure.